Premiering on January 4th, 1967, this iconic episode would mark the first command for Mr. Spock. The episode would be directed by Robert Gist, and the story would be by Oliver Crawford. The guest stars would be Darn Marshall as Mr. Boma, John Crawford as Commissioner Ferris, Peter Marco as Mr. Gaetano, Phyllis Douglas as Yeoman Mears. This episode would be based on the 1939 film Five Came Back, which starred Lucille Ball. That story was about a plane that crashed deep in the Amazon jungle in areas infested with hostile headhunting dangers. On Stardate 2821.7, we see the Enterprise on her way to Marcus 3 with much-needed medical supplies. While on the way there, they would pass a quasar-like anomaly called Morisaki 312. The Enterprise is also carrying Galactic High Commissioner Ferris, who is accompanying the supplies to Marcus 3. Once the emergency supplies reached Marcus 3, they would be immediately transferred to the New Paris colonies. The Galactic High Commissioner would express concern that the Enterprise was diverting to Morisaki 312 for scientific study. He would remind Captain Kirk of the importance of the supplies and his responsibility to deliver them safely and on time. Captain Kirk would remind Ferris that he also had standing orders to investigate all quasars encountered. He assured the High Commissioner that the delay would be minimal, saying the trip would take 3 days and the rendezvous would be in 5. Captain Kirk would give the go-ahead to Mr. Spock, who was commanding the shuttlecraft Galileo on the mission, to monitor and gather information on Morisaki 312. The Galileo would launch successfully and approach the anomaly. At first, the readings, the acceleration, and the Phase 1 separations indications were normal. Then the instrument readings would become problematic. At first, the position showed 3.7. Then Lieutenant Latimer indicated that the readings were all over the place. Mr. Boma said that it was to be expected, as quasars were extremely disruptive. Yeoman Mears would then inform Mr. Spock that the radiation levels were increasing. Mr. Spock would order the stopping of all forward momentum, but Latimer would indicate that they were unable to do so. Mr. Spock then attempted to contact the Enterprise and could not get a signal through. Mr. Boma indicated that it was due to the ionic interference. Mr. Spock would try to inform the Enterprise that they were headed uncontrollably towards Morisaki 312 and had harmful radiation that was pummeling the outer hull of the Galileo, and that they were on course 3.25. But that message would not be received fully. Back on the Enterprise, Captain Kirk would ask Lieutenant Uhura if any messages from the Galileo had come through. She said that she was only able to pick up part of a message saying that they had been pulled off course. She then said that they were not able to get a signal through to them, and Captain Kirk would tell Mr. Sulu to get a fix on the Galileo, but he would inform him the instruments were blank. At the science station, Captain Kirk would learn from the computer that the negative ionic concentration was 1.64 times 10 to the 9th power meters, and the radiation wavelengths were 170 angstroms, and that the harmonics were upwards along the entire spectrum. He would inform the Commissioner that the quasar had ionized the entire sector, rendering the instruments useless. He went on to say that there were 4 complete solar systems as well as 24-foot shuttlecraft somewhere lost, near inside of it. It would be like finding a needle in a haystack would be child's play compared to this situation. Commissioner Ferris would continually state that the trip to Marcus 3 was a top priority, and that Captain Kirk should not have sent the crew members out to begin with. Captain Kirk informed them that they still had 2 days to find them. Lieutenant Uhura would inform the captain of a Class M unexplored planet listed as Taurus 2 nearby. Captain Kirk would order Mr. Sulu to set a course and head for that planet. We then see the shuttlecraft as it had crashed on an unknown planet. Mr. Boma would suggest the magnetic potential of the effect was such that as they gathered speed, it was multiplied geometrically, and as a result, the Galileo was shot through the center of the effect like a projectile. Mr. Spock would attempt to contact the Enterprise, but would be unsuccessful. Dr. McCoy would inform Mr. Spock of the atmosphere, which consisted of partial pressure oxygen, 70 millimeters of mercury, and nitrogen at 140, breathable if you're not running in competition. Also traces of argon, neon, and krypton, all acceptable levels. However, he would state he wouldn't recommend this place as a summer resort. Mr. Spock would ask Mr. Scott for an assessment of the damage to the ship. He would then order Mr. Latimer and Mr. Gaetano to survey the area and to arm themselves. Mr. Spock would deduce that the Enterprise's instruments would be rendered inoperable due to the ionic interference and that they must be off the ground in order to have a chance of being detected. Later, as the Enterprise was in orbit of Taurus II, the captain would be informed that the transporter could not be used, as the return signal totally altered the object being beamed, and that it was not fit for human transport. He would then order the shuttlecraft Columbus out to search the planet's surface, and he instructs them to coordinate the coordinates with Mr. Sulu. The Commissioner would continue to pressure Captain Kirk on the importance of the trip to Marcus III, citing Book 19, Section 430B, Paragraph 12, which would assert his authority. Later, Mr. Scott would inform Mr. Spock that they had lost a great deal of fuel and that they had no chance to achieve escape velocity. He also said that if they intended to achieve orbit again, the craft must be reduced by a weight of 500 pounds. Mr. Spock would conclude that would be the weight of 3 grown men. Dr. McCoy would suggest equipment instead, but Spock would inform him that just about all of the equipment aboard the shuttlecraft was necessary. Mr. Boma would press Mr. Scott for who would be left behind, and Mr. Spock informed him, as well as the rest of the party, that his conclusion would be reached logically and through logical means. Later, as Mr. Latimer and Mr. Gaetano were surveying the area, they encountered a large creature who would attack them with a large spear. Mr. Latimer would be struck in the back and be killed. Mr. Gaetano would inform Mr. Spock of large creatures that attacked them, and he thought he had hit one while repelling the attack. Upon returning, seeing nothing, Mr. Spock observed that a fulsome point was used on the arrow that killed Mr. Latimer. This angered Mr. Boma, and Mr. Spock said that his concern for the dead would not bring him back alive. Mr. Gaetano and Mr. Boma would carry the body of Mr. Latimer back to the Galileo. Later, Lieutenant Uhura would inform the captain that the Columbus had finished searching quadrants 779X by 534M with no results, and Captain Kirk ordered them to the next section. She would go on to say that the sensors are still inoperable and that the transporter is still unsafe for use. Captain Kirk would order the increase of a 2-degree lattice in the search pattern in an attempt to increase the search area. Back on the Galileo, the crew had managed to lighten the load. Mr. Spock pointed out that it would still require the weight of a grown man to be left behind. Mr. Boma would inform Mr. Spock that the services were ready for Mr. Latimer. Mr. Spock said the repairs of the ship were of the utmost importance. Dr. McCoy said that they may all die, but at least they should die like men and not like machines. Later on, it would be Mr. Scott informing Mr. Spock that the pressure was dropping and they had lost the remainder of the fuel. Mr. Spock instructed Mr. Scott to search for alternatives, stating that there are always alternatives. Dr. McCoy would get Spock to go outside as they were hearing sounds of an impending attack. The general consensus was to attack them first to dissuade them from attacking the crew of the Galileo. However, Mr. Spock would order Dr. McCoy and Yeoman Mears back to assist Mr. Scott. He would then lead Mr. Boma and Mr. Gaetano off in an attempt to frighten off the attackers. Mr. Spock would cite his regard for other life forms as well as their responsibility to those life forms, whether they were hostile or not. While venturing out, they would come in contact with the creatures. The creatures would throw a spear at them and later a large object that resembled a shield. Mr. Spock would instruct Mr. Bowman and Mr. Gaetano to take aim at 10 and 2 o'clock. He ordered them to fire and deduced that the fear of the weapons would ward off the creatures. He would instruct Mr. Gaetano to remain to keep guard and maintain contact with the ship. Mr. Scott would then suggest using phaser power to replace the fuel supply in an attempt to re-achieve orbit. Of course, the problem with that is that the phasers were the only protection the party had against the creatures. The good news is that the shuttlecraft would be able to achieve orbit with a full load. However, it would not last long. Mr. Spock replied that it did not need to last long, as dying in orbit or the surface of the planet were the options if the Enterprise were not to see them. Later on, back on the Enterprise, the transporter's functions would be restored and deemed safe for human transport. Captain Kirk would order landing parties 1, 2, and 3 to report to the transporter room Ordnance Condition 1A. Back on the planet's surface, Mr. Gaetano would have a rock thrown at him and knock out his phaser, knocking it from his hand. When he attempted to retrieve it, a spear was thrown at him, keeping him from it. A creature would then come upon him and kill him, and it would be Mr. Spock who would go to look for him. While carrying Mr. Gaetano's body back, they would be attacked, but they would make it back to the shuttlecraft. Mr. Spock was confused on how the creatures reacted. He stated that the creatures should have seen their weaponry superiority and fled. Dr. McCoy angrily had said that respect was a rational process, and had it occurred to him that they would react emotionally with anger. Spock responded that he was not responsible for the creatures' unpredictability. However, Dr. McCoy said that they were perfectly predictable to anyone with feeling. That is when a creature would attack outside the Galileo by using a boulder to strike the top of the ship. Mr. Scott would use the Galileo's batteries to supercharge the outside shell. This would shock the creature and force its withdrawal for the meantime. While back on the Enterprise, the passing of the ion storm had all the instruments slowly returning back to normal. Landing parties would report casualties after being attacked by large hairy creatures that were vicious in nature. Commissioner Ferris would then cite Title 15 Galactic Authority figures ordering Captain Kirk to abandon the search and proceed directly to Marcus III. Captain Kirk would slowly set course while scanning as they departed. Later on the planet's surface, a service for Mr. Gaetano was being held when the creatures returned to continue their attack on the Galileo. Mr. Spock elected to use the boosters to lift off as the creatures were holding down the shuttlecraft. Once off the surface of the planet, they would have enough fuel for one orbit. Mr. Spock would then jettison the fuel and ignite it, propelling the shuttlecraft forward, and this surprised everybody. This was an attempt to send a flare or distress signal out to get the attention of the Enterprise. And it would ultimately work, as the Enterprise would see it and come about 180 degrees and transport the 5 survivors from the Galileo moments before it burned up in the planet atmosphere. Once back on board, the Enterprise would proceed to Marcus III at warp speed.